Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And returning guest, Jacob Reynolds. Welcome, Jacob.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Show today sponsored by Beckett's Gin, very proudly so. We'll talk a bit about them in a second. But first, Tom, do you want to tell our lovely listeners and viewers about the Spiked Christmas give-a-thon?
Absolutely. So it's that time of year again when we're asking people who read Spiked, who watch this podcast, who listen to our other podcasts to dig deep for us. Spiked, unlike any publication, I think, of our size, is still completely free because we're in the business of wanting to win hearts and minds, not just vlog subscriptions. So as we do throughout the year, but particularly at Christmas, we're asking if anyone out there, if you really enjoy what we do, if you think the media is a better place that we're in it, if we've kept you sort of sane, I guess, over the past few years as things have gone particularly mad, please do dig deep for us. I think a lot of people don't realise how much of our work is funded by donations. I mean,
it really is the majority. It's you, readers and listeners at home. You know, we have a few sponsors, but we are, as a dissenting magazine, you might have heard some stories about people being grey-listed for advertising. That's a very real problem for a magazine like us. So it is you at home who keep Spiked going and growing.
Yeah, 70% of our revenue comes from you watching this right now. So please do donate as much as you can. And we've also got a special offer on at the moment. So anyone who gives £50 or more over the Christmas and New Year's period, provided you live in the UK for postage reasons, will get one of these beautiful Spike mugs in the post. So to make your donation and to fill in your details for your mug, just go to spiked-online.com/donate.
And before we get on to the show, let's talk about another special Christmas offer. You can get 20% off a range of products from Beckett's Gin, our sponsor this week. You guys are enjoying the Spirited Gin made with juniper berries from Surrey. It's classic English gin, but with extra strong flavours. I'm enjoying the whiskey. This is brand new, this whiskey, Beckett's Gin whiskey. It was actually cured in a slow gin barrel, the first in the world to do that, and I'm really, really loving it. Spiked readers, viewers and listeners can get 20% off by going to beckettsgin.co.uk/spiked. That's beckettsgin.co.uk/spiked. beckettsgin.co.uk/spiked to get 20% off their brilliant range of products. There's really nothing else we can be talking about. This is tomorrow, the vote on assisted dying. We'll also talk about later the Labour MP who wants to introduce a blasphemy law. But first of all, Tom, this bill to legalise assisted dying, introduced by Kim Ledbetter, Labour MP, it's a private member's bill, but sort of supported partly by the government, even though they don't want to give a position. It's fair to say the bill itself, before we get into the wider issue of assisted dying, is a bit of a dog's dinner.
No, absolutely. Even if I did support assisted dying, which I don't, I wouldn't support this bill. It's a complete mess. And it's one of those things which I think that reality is starting to dawn on a lot of people. So broadly speaking, it's kind of in line with the sort of legislation you see when a country first legalises assisted suicide, which is that it's for terminally ill people with 6 months left to live. There are these supposed safeguards, a word that we could get into shortly, whereby it has to be signed off by 2 doctors about a week apart, and that also a High Court judge will have to sign off on this. The idea being that through this, there will be enough of a period of reflection for the patient themselves, but also any foul play, any coercion, whatever, could be sort of unearthed. But as many people have pointed out, in the 2 weeks, this bill has only been published 2 weeks ago, so MPs have had less time to consider this piece of legislation, huge potential shift in the relationship between the citizen and the state, than the actual bill itself envisages for someone to apply and then get assisted suicide. So it gives you a bit of an insight into how cramped this debate has been. But as people have been looking more at the legislation, they've been seeing that these supposed safeguards are really only fig leaves. I mean, the idea that we've got, I think it's 18 High Court judges in the family division. Any estimation of how many cases they would be dealing with would be in the thousands, basically. The idea in that each and every single case, they'll be taking enough time to weigh up what the rights and wrongs of this particular application are is ridiculous. Also, the idea that a health service which is struggling to keep people alive should be shifting towards, a system whereby it can legitimately kill people is, to me, a strange situation. I mean, I don't think people will be that surprised to find out that as part of the bill, there is this sweeping ban, essentially, on families being able to sue doctors and medical professionals involved in the assisted suicide, which should raise eyebrows, certainly. But I think the important thing to stress is that whilst a lot of the discussion has been about safeguards, it really is about the kind of moral principle about what this represents, the kind of line that's being crossed when you suggest that there are some people's lives who are just so wretched that their suicide should not only be that we should not only be kind of neutral on that question, but we should actually facilitate it. All of that is a real moral horror, but unfortunately the debate has been tied up unnecessarily, or perhaps understandably, with all of these questions about what the particular safeguards are and whether or not they're strong enough.
Yeah, Jacob, what have you made of the debate so far?
Well, yeah, I mean, and firstly on the safeguards, as I understand, it's not even like doctors who have to sign off on it. It's just medical professionals, which could be a very broad kind of category. And as people have noted, opens the door for, I mean, all kinds of people might get a reputation, for example, as being the doctor you go to if you need to get it signed off. The fact that they've talked about diagnoses of 6 months, which again, I mean, this is essentially a kind of plucking a figure out of the air when doctors give diagnoses of that length about how long you've got left to live. And again, there's concerns that people will be pushing for that special 6 month threshold to be reached so that they can then use that to go and apply for assisted dying. But I think this has thrown up, and the debate has really intensified, hasn't it, over the last few weeks, but it's thrown up really important questions about the health service, about the care service, about end of life treatment in general. And I think that there is a bit of a danger in the whole debate where obviously on a big moral issue like this, MPs finally get to do some actual kind of legislating on a big moral principle. It's not the minutiae of regulation. So everybody in a weird way has been kind of enjoying this because it is actually a big thorny question. But a lot of it has, and I agree, we need to talk about the morality, but in some sense, the morality is kind of allowed them to sidestep the issue of the fact that this is being introduced in a context where the NHS doesn't work, end of life care doesn't work, and that whole approach is in need of some serious questions being asked about it. And I think we all know the direction that this kind of leads in, which is that absent any solution to the NHS, absent any solution to end of life care and elderly care, this is going to become inevitably a way to relieve the pressure. And I see very little argument against the fact that the pressure on the system is such that this will inevitably be used as a kind of safety valve to let off the difficulty that we have, which sounds horrible to say it, but the difficulty that we have in dealing with the aging population and the care that people require as they get older.
And I think what is so alarming is that the kind of pro-assisted dying side really have devalued the significance of suicide. I mean, people may have seen these very glossy adverts on the tube, in particularly in Westminster, obviously, because that's where MPs are going to see them. You know, it shows these very happy people, you know, choosing the end of their life, you know, as if it's somehow empowering to kill oneself. Again, the language of assisted dying hides the horrors of what we're talking about here, which is, you know, encouraging people to do something that you would never do in a normal circumstance. If someone was about to jump off a bridge, you wouldn't push them. And yet we are about to say that actually in some circumstances that's okay. I struggle with that.
No, I think that's exactly it. And I think it's, on the one hand, the idea that in certain circumstances it's okay and in other circumstances is absolutely not, is at the core of the problem with this bill morally as well. I think you're essentially creating, as Kevin Yule's made this point on Spike many times, you're creating kind of two categories of citizens: those whose lives we will do everything we can to protect, those whose suicides we will do everything we can to stop, and those whose people, according to a couple of criteria, we believe their lives are so wretched that those suicides should, if anything, be facilitated. But there's also the question about what assisted suicide in the supposedly tightly defined bounds, although I'm sure we'll get into how quickly those bounds open once countries do legalise in many cases, is the message it sends about suicide in general. I think there is an unfortunate kind of cultural undertow in society, in Western societies at the moment anyway, which is that suicide, whilst nothing to be celebrated, is almost an understandable response to suffering. You certainly see that in the wake of discussions of, say, celebrities or prominent figures who might take their own lives after years of addiction or mental health problems or so on. There's this lack of an ability to make the moral case that suicide is a tremendously, profoundly destructive thing, but not just for the individual, but for those around them. And I think that's going to be an argument which becomes a lot harder to make in a situation in which you say there is such a thing as suffering that is so terrible that it's, as I say, not just justified, but actually we should help you take that life. And that's you can't go back from that.
And even within the supposedly tightly drawn limits of this bill, if you take a word like terminal, I mean, people imagine that to mean the most aggressive form of cancers, but technically it will be true for people who suffer from diabetes, people who suffer from eating disorders. Those are also considered terminal conditions in some cases. So already, even within this supposedly safest law in the world, you can see that actually the people we're potentially going to be facilitating the suicide of are not going to be just, elderly people with a few months left.
And I mean, that's why the discussion around safeguards and the arguments that are dismissed as kind of slippery slope fallacy arguments is so important to talk about that, because what we're talking about here is a question of principle. And once you cross a certain threshold with the question of principle, there's no logic that stops you. You introduce a bill and everyone says, it's going to have the highest safeguards in the world. We're only going to do this far. But you already are taking a step down a road. It's not a slippery slope. It's the acceptance of a principle, as you say, Tom, that some lives and in some circumstances, the correct or acceptable answer is that the suffering is too much and the state and wider society will help you end your life. That's a profoundly important moral principle that you can't just dismiss by saying we're going to put in place safeguards. And that's how we know, as from the other examples, that countries that tend to introduce these laws, they never stay as they're originally designed.
Yeah, because once you create a right, and in the context of human rights, suddenly, perversely, it becomes discrimination to deny someone their right to a state-assisted suicide. I mean, the most egregious example that people often come back to is Canada. Tom, do you want to tell us a bit about some of the, quite horror shows that, horror stories that we've heard from there?
And I think Canada is a useful analogue, I suppose, in the fact that it's over the course of the past 10 years that this has taken place. So in the space of about a decade, they've gone from having their medical assistance in dying program, as they call it, MAID, apply only to those with terminal illnesses whose deaths were, in the jargon, reasonably foreseeable, to a situation now where it's not an exaggeration to say that assisted suicide and euthanasia is basically being offered as an alternative to healthcare or an alternative to proper support for those who are suffering with disability. So people who have chronic illnesses can apply for MAID. There's been horrendous situations in which you've got people like Amir Farsood, who was a gentleman in his 50s who was about to be made homeless and applied for assisted dying on the basis of his chronic back pain and almost got as far as getting it. It became a huge story in Canada, so luckily he was able to get the resources to get out of that particular situation. There's also been horrendous examples of people who have actually just gone to the state, gone to various government ministries and asked for support for their disabilities. There was a Paralympian and a veteran who approached Veterans Affairs and said, can I have a chairlift for my wheelchair? And they were asked if they had thought about killing themselves instead. These cases indicate something. Yes, that might be one particular official who didn't know what they were doing, but it shows not only where the law has gotten to, but the climate that exists when you devalue life to that degree. And also, it's worth noting that in 2027, if they remain on course, they will extend MAID to people who are mentally ill, which has already happened in many places, including the Netherlands. So this is not a scare story. This is happening all over the shop. And even in Oregon, which is held up as very much the kind of template for this bill and the example that assisted suicide campaigners always like to reach for because it is more limited. Even there are people who have been given an assisted suicide on the basis of anorexia, on the basis of complications after a fall. This is not the tightly defined kind of circumstances that we've been sold. And as we've already been talking about, once you cross that Rubicon, it's the logical end. It's the logical consequence that it would expand to more and more people. Because why wouldn't it?
In the Netherlands and in Belgium, assisted suicide is offered to children. So again, anyone who talks about a slippery slope fallacy, it might sound like a clever word. You might sound, congratulations, you've read a book on philosophy, but it's not real. That's not how the real world works. That's not how politics works. It's not how the law works. And the slippery slope here is inevitable once we embark on this course.
Yeah, and we also have to talk about the social kind of context in which these debates are happening. And many of the same MPs pushing the assisted dying bill because they claim that it's a kind of important liberty to be able to end your life are the same MPs who are pushing, for example, at the moment, anti-smoking legislation, right? Or other bills or legislation that curtail people's freedom. And it's quite clear, as I think Spike writer J.J. Charlesworth pointed out earlier, that for them, anything that is kind of an expression of doing things, of being active in the world in freedom, that's the kind of freedom they camp down on. Yeah. And instead they celebrate these perversely called freedoms to end your life, which are about, as I said, the ending of things, not exercising your kind of agency in the world. And so the context in which this happens and the political message that's sent out as a society when we say that we're opening up a new frontier of people's freedom, which is the freedom to end your life, is, I think, a profoundly worrying indication of where broadly the discussion about freedom is in our society.
No, absolutely. It's like, I think the freedom and autonomy argument is such a nonsense. And it's demonstrated by the fact that broadly speaking, the people pushing for this, not exclusively, but in large part, don't care about freedom of autonomy in any other situation apart from the opportunity to end your life and therefore destroy any freedom or autonomy that you could possibly experience. I mean, if this really was a question of rights, why would you apply it only to people in a small amount of circumstances? It doesn't make any sense. But that's because this isn't about freedom, this isn't about autonomy. Suicide and death, as we've discussed, is the destruction of those things ultimately. And it is fundamentally about a shift in some of it is well-meaning, of course. People have seen loved ones, friends go through a certain experience. Some of it, I think a lot of it, is people's projections about their own anxieties about end of life and certain circumstances in which they would fear themselves getting into and not being able to get out. But you don't make law on that basis, and you certainly don't wrap it up in the arguments of freedom, which is what people have quite unconvincingly, I think, tried to do.
And to say one thing in favour of philosophers, Fraser, that having trained that
I'm
way
talking
myself.
about bad philosophers.
Yeah, but there's been quite a few cultural commentators and interesting critics have made the point that we really struggle to both understand the elderly as a category worthy of respect, given the wider kind of crisis of authority in society and the kind of profound infantilism of our society. But also we struggle to endow death with any meaning. And so we really struggle to understand this as the culmination of a life, which has its own kind of purpose and its own stage in your life. And that kind of the flight from death, the fear of dying that really pervades as a kind of cultural undertone lots of the debates here is an important driver of it. And it suggests again that the assisted dying debate has become a way of all of these kind of cultural insecurities and anxieties, whether about freedom or about aging or about death, it's like an easy way out for us all, because we no longer have to confront these difficult questions, and instead there's the state kind of supported, or in some cases state encouraged alternative that's there for us instead of asking these kind of more profound societal questions.
And I know we'll want to move on, but it is worth saying that I think it is instructive, if we're getting back to the bill and the policy question, that throughout the many decades that people have been campaigning for this, there's a reason that both disabled rights groups and organisations that represent people who work in end-of-life and hospice care oppose this legislation. Yeah. It's clear that it not only sends a message out in society that there are certain lives that aren't worth living, that are kind of wretched. This bill would give state sanction to that position, whether the proposers of it want to admit that or not, but also that it naturally and obviously distracts attention and resources and funding away from what could actually make people's deaths much more comfortable across the board. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. I mean, by the time people watch this, the debate will probably already be underway. But at the very least, you would hope in this bizarrely truncated period they've had to discuss it, enough MPs will have come to consider not just the questions of safeguards, but the profound kind of moral shift this would represent if it were to pass this week.
Taking care of your health can often feel like a full-time job. And it's so easy to lose motivation, especially in these cold winter months. But it needn't be a chore. And in fact, it's anything but with AG1. I drink AG1 every morning before my breakfast to stay the best version of myself. In just one scoop, mixed with water, AG1 gives me a comprehensive and convenient blend of over 70 high-quality ingredients. It's packed with vitamins, minerals, gut-friendly bacteria, mushrooms, and more. The biggest thing I've noticed since I started drinking AG1 is my improved immune system. That's because AG1 is full of vitamin C and zinc. I just don't get bogged down with those colds and flus that used to plague me every winter. Drinking AG1 every morning has also given me so much more energy. All the copper, chromium, and phosphorus in AG1 unlocks the energy from your food and gets it to where it needs to be. I never thought I'd say this, but I hardly ever drink coffee anymore. It's not surprising I'm feeling so much better since I started AG1. A team of scientists with more than a century of combined experience from fields like genetics, biochemistry, preventative and regenerative medicine are behind my every morning scoop. So, want to give it a shot? If you want to support your health now and in the long run, start with AG1. Subscribe now and get a free bottle of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Just go to drinkag1.com/spiked. Check it out. A very unusual question was asked during Prime Minister's Questions this week. The Labour MP, Tara Ali, Birmingham MP, got up and asked Keir Starmer if he would effectively introduce blasphemy laws fit for the 21st century, it seems.
November marks Islamophobia Awareness Month. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
He was complaining that lots of people are apparently desecrating holy books. There needs to be a ban on the desecration of Abrahamic faiths, books related to the Abrahamic faith, and it's essentially calling for a blasphemy law. And perhaps even more shocking was that Keir Starmer didn't actually put down this request. He didn't say, no, what century is this? Medieval blasphemy laws do not belong in in a modern democracy. I mean, Tom, what did you make of this little episode?
It was depressingly unsurprising, I suppose. I mean, this is one thing which comes up from time to time. You will have someone get up in Parliament. I believe Naz Shah, Labour MP, was the last person to essentially propose that we needed some form of blasphemy law in order to protect against the the depiction or the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad or the desecration of religious texts more broadly. It's often presented, in this case, the MP suggested that all Abrahamic faiths, why just Abrahamic? I'm not sure. Yeah. But it was a pretty transparent attempt to broaden it out beyond his own particular religious milieu, and no one was really buying it. But the fact that Keir Starmer would be incapable of just making a pretty clear principled point, which is to say that this is a country in which we don't criminalise people for blasphemy, is telling of the fact of where the Labour Party is, or where the Liberal left generally is on this particular question. They have got it into their heads that to stand up for the most kind of fundamental of kind of free speech rights, the right to blaspheme and to mock gods and prophets, is culturally insensitive. Yeah. And I think that's the position that they've ended up in. And the fact that the MP himself wrapped this in the garb of this is Islamophobia Awareness Week, I think tells you everything you need to know about where that particular campaign has always been headed as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it just made it clear, explicit, that Islamophobia is about, stopping criticism of Islam itself, not so much about racism against Muslims, which we all object to. Whereas obviously everyone should have the right to criticize and mock Islam as they see fit.
Yeah, well, it attempts to encode a really regressive idea that, as you say, it's like a race, that adhering to a certain set of religious beliefs about Islam is identical to a race, i.e. that you couldn't change them, you couldn't wake up one day and change your mind on these things. You'll always be defined by that. And it really is, I mean, it's not medieval, strictly speaking, the blasphemy law, because it's recast in the contemporary identity politics kind of language, where what we're talking about here is hurting people's feelings and their offense and damaging their sense of self. And you're right to point out that the MP in question tried to make it about Abrahamic religions, but I think everybody knows that there are no Christians out on, or at least I haven't met any Christians out on campaigns to stop criticisms of the Bible, and that really as we know from high-profile cases, that there is a particular problem around the fact that certain Islamically or Islamist influenced people find criticism of Islam unsupportable, unacceptable, and that we have to take a stand for the right to blaspheme, the right to mock the Prophet, but also place it in that context of this is a hard-won Enlightenment era freedom that we have to defend.
And Tom, finally, I mean, don't we, in a way, unfortunately, we already have a kind of informal blasphemy law, because you can be hounded out of your job, you can be hounded out of polite society for criticising Islam, even if the law itself doesn't intervene.
No, absolutely. It's worth remembering, staggeringly still to this day, that the Batley Grammar School teacher is still in hiding. And it's also worth remembering that immediately after that scandal, where a teacher, for showing cartoons that were very much apt to the religious studies lesson on freedom of speech that he was teaching, was leapt upon by all these Islamist campaigners who shut the school down for a number of days, flooded his inbox with death threats, and then led to him having to essentially flee with his family for his life. That when that happened, the local Labour MP, then Tracy Brabid, now the mayor in that area, essentially congratulated the school for suspending him. Who essentially threw him under the bus.
Yeah.
And that's a reminder of what this whole story is. Yes, there is an Islamist intolerance which exists in society, which is really trying to gear up this campaign to not just punish but actually criminalise, in this instance, blasphemy against this particular religion. But the problem has always been that that's met a sense of, at best, ambivalence, if not kind of tacit support amongst the liberal left, who have, for some bizarre reason, come to see the idea of freedom of speech as essentially something that you cannot reconcile with Muslim Brits, which to me is the most anti-Muslim thing you could possibly suggest, that they're not capable of the cut and thrust of a free society in the way that anyone else is. So it's always been that combination of, yes, the campaigners who are pushing for this sort of thing, but also the way in which certain sections of politics, particularly the kind of liberal left, are quite willing to swing open that door at various points.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.